Thanks very much for joining us for Across Africa, our weekly look at stories from across the continent. I'm Georgia Calvin-Smith, and this week, Cameroon hasn't quite eased up its battle against polio. Although it was declared free of the disease earlier this year, it's launched an immunization drive against a particular strain of the virus. Also, Kenya has bucked a regional trend that's seen elephant populations halve over the last 3 decades. It's seen a baby boom for the animals, but despite the promising numbers, the species remains vulnerable. And students in Libya are caught between conflict and coronavirus. Traditional classes have been upended, and many are turning to homeschooling or holding lessons outdoors. But first, Cameroon is still keeping up efforts to stamp out polio despite being declared free of the disease earlier this year. New cases of type 2 polio have since cropped up in some parts of the country where few children are inoculated. A new vaccination drive has recently been launched. Our team sent us this report.
Infants crying in a hospital in Yaoundé. They are being vaccinated against polio. A vaccination campaign is underway in Cameroon, despite it having been declared polio-free only a few months ago. But all types of the disease have not been eliminated.
Nos camons ont été déclarés free de poliomyélite. Cependant, les souches environnementaux ont été découverts. Et compte tenu du fait qu'on voudrait protéger la population d'une future épidémie, on a décidé de faire des campagnes de vaccination contre la poliomyélite.
Mobile teams have been dispatched to several districts in the capital to inoculate as many children as possible. Polio attacks the nervous system and can cause irreversible paralysis. In 2018, there were only about 30 cases worldwide. On the ground, some parents try to stop the medical teams from treating their children. They are mistakenly worried that the kids are being given COVID-19. Team leader Isidore Ekobo says misinformation like this can be dangerous.
Beaucoup de parents pensent qu'on vient plutôt inoculer la Covid à leurs enfants. Or, c'est un vaccin qui est vraiment important parce qu'un enfant qui atteint le polio, c'est irréversible.
Despite her initial doubts, health workers have convinced Vanessa to let her 3 children be vaccinated.
Au départ, j'ai eu peur que c'était une phase contre le coronavirus. Mais bien après, j'ai compris que non, c'était pour prévenir la polio. Et c'est pour ça que j'ai accepté qu'on vaccine mes enfants.
More campaigns are planned for the coming months to prevent a resurgence of polio. The goal is to vaccinate nearly 5 million babies and children up to 5 years old.
Ivory Coast heads into high-stakes elections at the end of the month. Ahead of the poll, our Sam Bradpiece headed to the political capital, Yamoussoukro, to find out more about the hopes of young people there looking for more opportunities.
Imagine the scene. It's the turn of the 20th century, and instead of the grand 6-lane highway you see behind me, we're surrounded by dense green forest, and in a small clearing, there's a village named Ngoko with less than 500 people. They are led by Queen Yamoussoukro, after whom the city of Yamoussoukro is now named. She was a distant relative of Ivory Coast's first post-independence leader, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, whose statue stands proudly across from the presidential palace. Houphouët-Boigny was born here and designated this place as the country's political capital in 1983. Today it is host to the Senate, the tallest basilica in the world, but despite being the capital, no public university. I'm here with Namisata Songare, who is finishing her studies in one of the city's private universities. Namisata, can you tell me, after years of study, what do you think of Ivory Coast's education system?
Education in our country is a big problem. For example, when we finish our pre-university studies, if we dream to continue and study engineering, for example, the state doesn't help us. We are on our own.
And in terms of changes you would like to see from the government at the next presidential election?
We want the president to really focus on development. For example, here in Yamoussoukro, the political capital, there is not even a public university.
Yamoussoukro was conceived of as a grand and majestic capital, but since the death of Félix Houphouët-Boigny in 1993 remains a shell of a city. Successive presidents since then have made empty promises to reinvigorate the place.
G20 nations have agreed to extend a debt suspension initiative for the world's poorest countries until June 2021. The move is good news for the many African nations who've had to borrow more from the international market to help deal with the fallout from COVID-19. But some analysts say that more could still be done and are pushing for debt to be written off altogether. Fraser Jackson has more.
Another 6 months respite for the world's poorest countries. G20 finance ministers have agreed to prolong a freeze on debt repayments for up to 73 nations, allowing them to focus their funds on the coronavirus pandemic.
The pandemic has aggravated debt vulnerabilities and threatened the fiscal sustainability of many countries, particularly the poorest countries.
Under the G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative, or DSSI, repayments can be deferred but not reduced. Campaigners have said the step doesn't go far enough, calling for debts to be forgiven altogether. The president of the World Bank was more measured.
So it's important for the people in the poorest countries to see an actual reduction in the amount of debt, a ray of hope for the future. There are more steps that are needed in order to achieve meaningful debt relief for the poorest.
According to the Jubilee Debt Campaign, over 50 countries are already in a debt crisis, shown here in red, and the pandemic has further compounded things. In 2019, the world's 73 poorest nations owed $178 billion to their government creditors alone, most of whom were G20 states. But an additional $100 billion has been borrowed just since April. African countries make up the majority of the participants within the G20's DSSI debt repayment program. Some have received money from the G20's largest single creditor, China, but up until now, Beijing has been unwilling to write off debts owed. Further discussions on the program are set to be held before the G20 summit in November.
Although elephant numbers across East Africa have fallen over the years, Kenya is an exception. It's seen a baby boom that's doubled its elephant population over the last 30 years. The abundance is in part down to strict anti-poaching policies, but poachers aren't the only threat to the animals. Their populations are affected by climate change and clashes with communities around the land where they roam. Our correspondents report.
At 6:30 a.m., the patrol begins in the Loisaba Reserve in central Kenya.
It's basically just flying around Loisaba, locating anything of interest, any populations, the densities, where they are.
Josh quickly locates an elephant.
Anything of interest, we usually throw on this phone, which is essentially a smart tracking app.
Once he's back on the ground, Josh and the rangers make their way towards the animals he located from the plane.
So basically, what I can see so far is there's about 13 to 15 ellies in here. You've got a couple very small ellies, under 6 months old. And then you've got quite a few adolescents, some of them pushing 2-3 years. And the adolescents are the ones you can see, slightly bigger ones in the distance there.
Patrols are conducted on a daily basis. Thanks to this surveillance method, since 2017, no animal was killed by poachers in Loisaba. But rangers have to stay vigilant.
We don't actually anticipate maybe poachers or anything, but in case they might be there, the bad men, then we are there for them.
The Kenyan population has tripled over the last 4 decades, encroaching on the territory of wild animals. Farmers particularly dread elephants and often react violently to the presence of pachyderms on their land. Only 3 years ago, the animals were coming here on a regular basis to eat maize from the field.
Elephants have become our friends because they don't disturb us anymore. Before, we would sometimes kill them. We really saw them as enemies because they were destroying all our crops. But now that they're well kept in reserves with fences, we enjoy seeing them.
Everywhere in Kenya, yields have to be protected, but elephants are now seen in a different light. Although they may cause damage to crops, their presence can also be beneficial to the population.
Students in Libya are caught between conflict and coronavirus. Traditional classes have been upended and many are turning to homeschooling or holding lessons outdoors. Nicolas Chemin has more.
Falak is a university professor in Misrata, but now he's also homeschooling his sons and nephews. Many Libyan students were unable to go to school for months because of the pandemic.
أستطيع أن أدرس أبنائي لأن أنا أستاذ جامعي وأدرس أبنائي كما لاحظت أنت وأيضا أبناء أخي اللي في سن اللي في صف الخامس وتحت ولكن بعض العائلات أو أغلب الناس لا يوجد لديهم من يدرسهم وبالتالي هذا يؤدي إلى فشل في الطالب.
In the schools that are open, students have to wash their hands before entering the premises. They have their temperatures taken. In the classrooms, masks are mandatory. Some schools are trying outdoor classrooms. The authorities said that despite the context, the students would have to pass an exam to progress to the next grade, a decision criticized by many parents.
يعني عندي عيل في صف رابع يعني مأساة إنه كان ما قراش السنة هذه لأن بالذات خاصة الصف أول ابتدائي عندك ما كملوش الحروف ما قروش زين هذه كل منها ترتب عليها هي السنة الجاية ما نعرفش الحل شنو اللي بيدير التعليم وقرارات التعليم دي عشوائية بدون دراسة.
In Libya, the coronavirus is not the only problem affecting schools. The fighting in the country between a UN-backed government and the troops of Khalifa Haftar have displaced 90,000 children. 200 schools have had to close, depriving more than 200,000 children of their classes.
Well, that's it for Across Africa. Thanks very much for joining us, and do so again if you can. Take care.